Well, I think we're going to go ahead and start. I'm Freya Sachs, co-chair of the Jewish book series in Nashville this year with Margaret Littman, and we are thrilled you are all here to join us and to hear from JaiChakrabarti tonight. He's the author of the novel A Play for the End of the World, winner of the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction, longlisted for the PEN/Faulkner Award, author of the forthcoming short story collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, which is out next month. And I'm hopeful we'll get to hear just a bit more about that a little later in our evening. And his short fiction has appeared all over the place, from the O. Henry Prize stories to the Best American Short Stories to the Pushcart, and has won a Pushcart Prize. And born in India, he now lives in New York and is joining us from there this evening. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Freya, and thanks for having me. I am going to kick us off with a short video before we go into the conversation to ground us in some of the context for this book.
Thank you.
The writing process for this novel involved many revisions over many years. This is my first novel, so I had no idea how to write a novel, and I was figuring it out along the way. This is a story about two people who fall in love despite the history of their traumas and despite all of the counter forces that are conspiring to pull them apart. And it's the story of how they figure out how to navigate those tensions and whether it makes sense for them to be in partnership. And this is also a historical novel, and it's a story about a play that was performed in an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, and how that play then gets performed 30 years later in a village in India, and how the performance of that play ends up changing the lives of villagers who are fighting for their lives, who are fighting for their right to land. You know, art doesn't just exist in one way. It doesn't just exist solely to save us, but you know, it has all of these hidden rooms, and I wanted to live in those rooms through India and Poland.
This is Gopalpur, the professor said. This is where they will perform your play. This time, Jaryk didn't bother to correct the professor that it wasn't his play. He was looking at the goats tethered to a barn, at a lonely cow that grazed the field. Next to the huts, there were rows of gardens. In the center was a well. A boy drew water, the squeak of the pulley against the hinge, like a long-lost melody. For a moment, he tried to imagine her here with him, making a hut of their own.
I think in earlier versions, I had perhaps more of a writerly agenda of what I wanted the characters to do or where I wanted the book to go. And I think that the revision process, what I've learned, is a kind of letting go of that writerly intention. And it is a kind of deepening or immersion into connecting with the characters and seeing, you know, more of how they might see the story of what they might want to do. So that was a deep education for me. You know, there's a scene with the rabbi and Jaryk sort of later in the novel, and he's thinking about, well, what is the question that he really wants to ask if he's going to go and get counsel from the wise rabbi. And you know, he asks a series of questions, and he realizes the question that he really wants to ask is this question of, after everything, am I capable of love? So I was really interested in exploring this idea of love almost as like an act of resistance.
All right, so I will pause the video there and be happy to dive deeper into this, and looking forward to the conversation with you, Freya.
Yes, thank you. So I really loved the book and loved reading it, and I'm excited to get to talk about it. I love the layering of the historical and thinking about the Warsaw story, the story of Calcutta, the story of um, these two folks who fall in love and have to figure out what that looks like, and the interspersing of literary forms and moments with the play within the novel and with the lines of poetry. I guess I'm curious to start, like, how did you come to this story?
Yes, and I think you may be my ideal reader, Freya, so thank you, thank you very much. So I came to this story when I was living in Jerusalem with my partner, the poet Alana Bell. Alana had gotten a travel grant as she was working on her first collection of poems. She's also the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Her mom was born in Israel, so it was an opportunity for both of us to be in the Holy Land together. And on our last day in Jerusalem, after we'd been living there for about half a year or so, we visited Yad Vashem. And it was at Yad Vashem that there was an exhibit called Art in the Ghettos. And it's where I first learned about this historical correspondence, which is that in 1942, Henrik Goldschmidt, otherwise known as Janusz Korczak, chose to stage a Bengali play in July of that year. And just that fact alone was extraordinary for me, that Janusz Korczak could turn to art in such a difficult moment in time. But this play was not any play. First of all, it was a Bengali play. It was a play written by Rabindranath Tagore. And as a child growing up in India, I had memorized Tagore's poems. In fact, in the school that I went to, we had even had a performance of this particular play, which in Bengali is called Dakor. In English, it's called The Post Office. So in that moment in Jerusalem, I was absolutely transfixed, because it felt like it connected this experience, this memory from my childhood, and also this powerful, moving story of what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's started for me a long period of research, because I wanted to understand who Janusz Korczak was, why he chose to stage a Bengali play of all things, and what it meant for his children in that moment. So that was kind of the beginning of a long road.
Yeah, and so I have 8 new questions based off of that, but I'm curious, thinking about the historical component, how true you felt like you needed to be to the historical facts, and how that helped you start to shape where this went. And is that sort of historical truth as present in the Calcutta sections as it is in the Warsaw sections, and in the kind of references to Paris?
Yeah,
Hearing.
it's a great question. And one of my literary influences is the writer Penelope Lively, who's written historical fiction. And she talks about how the writer exposes only 1/8 of the iceberg when they do historical research, and the rest 7/8, the writer doesn't show to the reader, but it's part of how you construct the landscape. And for me, it was really important to do the work to feel grounded in that place and time. So during my graduate study, I got to spend, I got to do seminars on Holocaust literature, and ended up spending time in Poland working with Janusz Korczak scholars to put together this very rich tapestry to figure out who he was and what that time and place was like. I also then went to Shanti Niketan, which is about 2 hours from the place I was born, and spent some time doing research there. And then after I had finished a draft of the book, I realized that there was one place that I hadn't done very much research on, which was New York in the 1970s. And I don't know, and I realized I don't know anything. I didn't know anything about New York in the 1970s. So I had to go back and do a bit of archival research about New York City as well in that time period, which that was a lot of fun.
Sure. And it's such sort of seemingly disparate places that ultimately are all in moments of transition and change. And I found myself thinking a lot about the ways of sort of political crisis and kind of these quests for political power and the way that children are used in those moments. I'm curious if you talk a little bit about kind of how you were thinking about sort of channeling these children, crafting these children, thinking about also kind of the legacy of the trauma of these sort of early moments that these characters are left with.
Yes. So one of the things that Tagore wrote about in reference to this play is that it avoids sentimentality because it's a play performed by children, and that as adults, while we might have our hackles up in other plays with adult characters, because it's an experience of children, we're more likely to put our hearts fully into it. And I think Tagore was very conscious of that. I mean, he was a writer who was very intentional about the themes that he was choosing. And maybe this is a good moment to talk about why Korczak chose that play in particular.
Please.
So the play, The Post Office, is about a young child who is, excuse me, quarantined in his home. And he has a mysterious illness, and his life is really through his imagination. So he has encounters with kids outside the house. He asks them to play with his toys because that's kind of how he vicariously experiences the joy of that. And he imagines what it must be like far away, the waterfalls, the mountains. It's all really through his imagination, which becomes this really potent and powerful instrument for him. So Korczak, I think, certainly saw the opportunity there in this theme of the mind as a central resource. And the other part of this play is that this young child, Amal, has a mysterious illness, and he, in the end of the play, it's suggested that he's passing off into the afterlife. And part of Janusz Korczak's philosophy as an educator, as a pedagogue, was to prepare his children for the difficult moments. And in July of 1942, he was conscious of the fact that dark times, they were in dark times, and even darker times were coming. And so this was part of the way that he, I think, was helping to prepare his children for whatever may come.
Yeah. And I think there's something so interesting in that, and then in the way that Jaryk carries on this sort of care for children as he goes to India and finding that connection with the play being performed again and sort of his changing roles.
Yes.
Within that.
Yes. And so Jaryk, who is the main character, he is a child originally when this play is performed, and in India, he is an adult, and I think he feels a certain duty as he was protected by Pandoktor, by Janusz Korczak during that time, to pay it forward, so to speak. So I think there's this strong inheritance of love that Jaryk feels that he wants to pass on when he has an opportunity to again stage the play and direct it at India.
And I'm interested in sort of the different ideas of love that show up in the book, because there's the romantic love story, but it feels like, which I'd be interested for you to talk a little bit about how that layers into kind of the historical pieces and the choices in that. But I also found myself really fascinated by the different types of love and care that show up in ways that feel just as important here to that romantic story that unfolds.
Yeah, I often think of this book as a love story in three dimensions. One is, of course, the romantic love story between Jaryk and Lucy, a woman from the American South. But then there's these two other ones. One is this love that Doctor Janusz Korczak had for his children and how that informs Jaryk and Misha and how they then react to that in India. And then the third love story is this between brothers, between Jaryk and Misha. So Misha being Yaryk's oldest friend from Pandukter's orphanage, and how the ghost of Misha, who passes away early in the novel, informs many of the choices that Jaryk makes.
Yeah, I found that Misha's role fascinating in the ways that loss of that particular type of love and connection to, in the ways that connects to his past, felt like such a driving force for him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think Misha becomes a kind of father figure for Jaryk to some extent. They're about 10 years. There's about a 10-year difference between the two of them. Yeah, so there is a duty that he feels there as well.
Yeah. So I also found myself thinking a lot about the role of art, and thinking about, as I was reading, I was thinking a little bit about sort of art and survival, and kept having the line from really Star Trek that Emily St. John Mandel borrows in Station 11, that because survival is insufficient.
Yeah, right.
And
yeah.
the echo of that, and I'm curious about that question of how art keeps people going in these moments of trial and distress and trauma, and the ways that you're able to kind of think through that in the novel.
Yeah, well, it's a question that obsessed me, I would say, as I was writing this book. And I'll also share that as I was writing this book, I had existential questions about what it means to be a writer, in the sense that, is it a worthy vocation? Is it something that is contributing to the world? And as I started to encounter some of these stories, for example, the poetry of Abraham Sutskever, who wrote poems while hiding from the Nazis. One of his poems describes being in a coffin, and the experience there of still wanting to commit words to a page. And this was a consistent theme through the Holocaust, but in general, through times of crisis, what I found is that people come to art. There is something about the imagination and the ability to express oneself in community that is so, so important. And one of my influences for this book, as I was doing the India research, came to be this gentleman by the name of Safdar Hashmi, who was a playwright who put on plays in the streets of Delhi in 1970s and 1980 India. And these would be plays attended by thousands of people. They would often be in the service of improving workers' conditions. So he would highlight the terrible conditions of factory workers, for example. And in 1989, Safdar Hashmi would be assassinated by thugs hired by the Indian government. So this is somebody who not only spent his life in art, in direct action, but also paid a very terrible price for that. And he was once asked this question of, well, do you think your art makes a difference? Do you think it matters? And his answer really stayed with me, which is that he said it doesn't directly make a difference, but what it does is it allows us to have an expanded vocabulary. It changes the way we might speak about a subject, how we might see it, and allows us with that shared vocabulary to move forward and into social change.
And that's helpful in thinking about that. And I wonder too, what layer of that you were able to bring into it by including the lines from the poems and including these moments from the play. within the text. I really appreciated the way it moved from here's a scene here, here's this other moment, making clear some of those parallels, even as each scene had its own integrity, and layering in those scenes of performance and of that other layer of art. Felt like it added something in terms of that conversation.
Yeah. And I was also trying to be honest about the fact that art is, even the same piece of art doesn't have to be performed in the same way and can have very different effects. So, to be really clear about this, when the post office is performed in Janusz Korczak's orphanage, I see it as an act of ennoblement. I see it as a beautiful act of human history that is worthy of celebration. In the novel, when it's performed in India, I think it's a much more complicated set of forces that are acting upon it. The professor who is involved in bringing this together has his own political agenda, and that muddies the waters. And yet it's the same play, and yet there are people in need in both circumstances. And I think that is also true of art, which is we have to be careful about how we turn to it and in the circumstances by which we turn to it.
Right. And the role of the audience within that and the interpretation that is then filtered through the novel is an interesting layer to it.
Yes. Who is in the audience? Why are they there? What is their agenda in coming to witness? And in Janusz Korczak's orphanage, it was really important for him to bring as much of the community together as possible. So you have folks like Spielman, who, for folks who've seen The Pianist or read the memoir, The Pianist, he invited Władysław Spielman, this world famous pianist, to open the performance by playing Chopin. And the whole community came to witness that. And in India, there's a different community that comes, and they understand the political ramifications of being in the audience. So just coming to witness the play becomes a political act.
Right. And I'm reminded too of sort of my bias as I read, right? Of like, I have a much better understanding of Holocaust history, of the Warsaw Ghetto in that moment, of what that might have meant. Whereas I found myself pausing and going, okay, I follow, and there's plenty in the book to guide me towards what's happening with this particular performance of the play. But my, kind of cultural understanding isn't present in the same way. And that was an interesting moment for me.
Yeah, I think that, I don't think I would have been qualified to write a book that is solely set in the Warsaw Ghetto. So what I was able to bring to this novel from my own life experience was the confluence of those histories, being someone who has kind of straddled these cultures. And I think what that means is that there might be readers who are less familiar with one side of the story than the other, but hopefully it encourages them to read a little bit more about that history. Talking a moment about that period of time in India and Bangladesh. So the 1971 war, through which Bangladesh became its own country, by the estimates of the Bangladeshi government, 3 million people lost their lives in that conflict. My own maternal grandparents, they fled Bangladesh because of religious persecution, with pretty much the clothes on their back. And so it's one of those stories that's not particularly well known in America, in the same way the story of Janusz Korczak is honestly not very well known in America. So if I can encourage a few people to learn a little bit more about both of those stories, it's a great privilege.
Well, and it's a gift to readers who might pick it up looking for one of those stories or having that familiarity with one, neither, or both, to discover those kind of resonances and ways of thinking about all the kind of layers of trauma and how people distrust and trust each other and where those small moments of trust can be found.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned in the video you shared with us at the beginning how much revision was involved. Could you talk a little bit about the process of writing
Sure.
this novel? And I think you said that it took many years to kind of get to this point and sounds research intense.
Yes. Yeah. It took about 10 years from start to finish. And, if I had known how difficult it would be, I would have probably run the other direction, honestly. But the way that my process works in general is that for a first draft, I do, as E.L. Doctorow says, writing into the fog, which is to say that I have a vague idea of where I'm going next, but I don't have an outline. I don't know really much of what's going to happen in the novel. And I want to be surprised. Like, that's the joy in it for me as a writer, is to just figure out, oh, this is a possibility that can happen between the characters that I didn't think about, that's unexpected to me. And that's a lot of fun in the first draft, which makes it also a very messy process because it can, spool off into a lot of threads. And then the majority of the work for me is really in the revision process. And as I have worked on my craft, that has become more of a systematic process for me, where I try to really map every scene in the book, try to figure out what are the scenes supporting, what are the scenes that really don't belong in the novel. So, for example, in this one, there's a fairly minor character by the name of Mrs. Paul, who used to be a more major character in the book. She had about 100 pages just in her point of view. And in revisions, I had to take all of that out because as I was thinking about the book as a whole and thinking about the thematic texture of it, it didn't make sense for this novel, even though I was having a lot of fun writing in her voice. It just wasn't the right book for it.
But I do have to wonder if she's such a, I smile when you mention her name because she doesn't show up that much, but I feel like there's a richness to her. And I wonder if some of that comes from how much time you spent with her, even if it's not time the reader gets.
Yeah. One of my, so when I did my MFA, my thesis advisor, Joshua Henkin, he liked to talk about in one of his novels, he had a major character that was reduced to a single cameo in a single paragraph.
Wow.
He liked to say that he was very proud of that one paragraph because of all of the work he put into making that character that ultimately didn't make it into the final draft, but did inform the choices. And I hope that's true. All of the work we do off the page, the shadows of it are still there.
Yeah, so I have a couple more kind of craft related questions. And then if folks, I see one already, but if folks have questions you want to put into the chat box, we'll get to those in just a few minutes as well. I am curious, a couple of things. You have a short story collection coming out just around the corner. Will you talk a little bit about how working in that sort of short fiction, short form feels in relation to working on the novel, and tell us a little bit about that project?
Yes. So the way I think about working on a novel is you are kind of on a deserted island. You have a little bit of food and water, but you're kind of stuck on that deserted island with whatever flora and fauna. And if you happen to have a soccer ball, then even better. The short story, because it's really built on discrete moments, I think it allows a kind of breathing, is how I think about it. Whereas the novel, it's just such a large tapestry that, when I'm writing a novel, I have to be so in it. But the short story, I can kind of dip into, I can think about the moment and I can walk out of it. So I suppose I think about both of those from a kind of the experience of writing them. the level of claustrophobia experienced when I'm in the moment. But I love the short story form. In many ways, I will say that is my first love after poetry. And there's something about it that allows, I think, myself as a reader to get really close to characters in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the book that's coming out.
Sure. It's called A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. And there are a couple of themes there. It does, like this book, involve multi-ethnic families. There are Indian and Jewish characters. And really the overarching theme is one of chosen family, how we find and forge the bonds outside of our birth families, and also about the struggles of having children. So while I was working on this book, my partner and I were going through the process of trying to have a kid, the difficult process of trying to have a kid. And my son, who is now 7, it feels like a world ago, but that was a big part of my psyche while I was writing the collection.
Yeah. As you talked about that title, I'm reminded too of A Play for the End of the World as a title. When did that come to you?
It came to me while I was writing a scene in the book. So there's a scene in the book between Igor Nurli and Janusz Korczak, Pound Doctor. Nurli was a historical figure and a good Samaritan who on multiple occasions tried to get Janusz Korczak out of the ghetto. So Korczak at that point was a notable figure. He had his own radio show. He'd written children's books. He was revered in Poland, and Nurli, being a good friend, came over and offered him safe passage. And Korczak, he writes about this in his diary. He said that, it's a very kind offer, but there's no way that I'm going if I can't bring along 200 children with me. And as I was writing that scene, the two of them also begin to talk about the play that they're going to perform. And Igor Nurli says, well, what do you mean you're performing a play in this time, in this moment? And Korczak says, well, it's a play for the end of the world, of course. And I just loved the resonance of that. And I loved the potential meanings that come from just that phrase.
Sure. It shows up in so many different ways within the worlds you've built. I am curious who you think your novel and your stories, like what other works are they in conversation with?
Quite a few. So, there's a character in the book, a rabbi, who I can see being part of an Isaac Bashevis Singer story.
Yeah.
So there's that one. Then there's a novel by Jhumpa Lahiri called Lowland, which is about the Naxalite Revolution, a similar time period in Indian history that I think it's in conversation with. Then, I sometimes worry about saying this one, but being somebody who was reading a lot of modernism at the time, I think it is in conversation with Ulysses because of the play inside of the book. So in Ulysses, Joyce is trying to get really deep, getting close into the consciousness of a single character, and he's trying all kinds of narrative structures. And finally, in chapter 13, he writes a play within the book, and that was an inspiration for me to write some sections as play parts. And in earlier drafts of the novel, there were many more play parts, which I trimmed down. But I do owe a debt to Joyce for that narrative technique.
There's also the place as character that's showing up in such strong ways here too. That the scenes feel as if they could only be in Brooklyn or only be in Warsaw or only be in India in those moments.
And I think, maybe an influence there for me would be Michael Ondaatje, who, also began as a poet before he was a fiction writer. And he's someone who's deeply concerned with place.
Mhm.
And for me, I think place can be another character in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to shift gears slightly to open questions for folks if there are other things you're curious about to put in the chat. We'll start with Miriam's question, kind of circling back earlier, kind of curious if you can talk some more about trust and distrust in the novel as a theme, how it works amongst the characters and also within themselves.
Trust and distrust. What an interesting question. Well, I think that there is this perspective of trust through the child's experience, which is a very trusting experience. And the way in which Tagore writes the play is about a child who's very open to the world and trusting of the world. And I think that is also the case for Pandukter's children in this book, who are very trusting that their protector is going to be with them. And in fact, he is with them. And so I think this notion of distrust comes through adults, comes through the older characters in the book. And this idea of what is safe to share and what is not safe to share becomes really central for Jaryk, who is a survivor and does not immediately have enough trust in Lucy to share his whole past with her. And he never really does throughout the novel. So I think that becomes a central tension in the book as to how much Jaryk can trust the woman, the love of his life, and whether that's going to be enough for them to make it.
Right. And I kept having to remind myself that as readers, we have such a fuller view of so many of these stories.
Right. And this is in 1972. She's a woman from North Carolina. Holocaust education was not prevalent in America in general at that time,
Right.
but especially so for a woman in North Carolina. So, we as readers, not only do we have the benefit of the historical perspective, but also we are able to get a window into Jaryk's past, which Lucy doesn't have. And so it establishes, I think, a kind of dramatic tension in the book where we as readers feel perhaps a different kind of empathy toward Jaryk than Lucy's able to, because she just doesn't have access to that.
Right. And that sort of narrative shift of the way of what we're granted access and perspective to and are reminded of, I think, what the characters don't have. It's
Exactly.
part of what makes those sort of tensions so compelling and causes that kind of, for me at least, a different sort of engagement of like, but if she only understood, oh wait, he won't tell her. And in so many moments, if this person only knew or understood.
I felt the same way as I was writing the book, and I think, yeah, absolutely, that is one of the central devices of the novel, is how much Lucy doesn't know and how much we as readers do know.
Right. So Nancy's curious. You talked about the difference for you between writing a novel and writing short stories, and she's wondering if the process of writing the novel, or perhaps because of the span time that novel writing requires, your story writing has changed in any way, with form or language, angles of vision, kinds of discoveries that interest you.
Such a great question. What I will say about story writing in general is that I think of it as this powerful technology that we have to think about all the potential lives we could be living that we're not living. So as we read about characters who are doing crazy things, ill-advisable things in relationships, for example, we can maybe learn a little bit about ourselves from the choices we're not making or the choices we are making. And the reason I bring this up is because for me, as I have grown more into my craft, I have become more and more interested in character dynamics, in the choices that characters make or don't make, and how the novel can provide a kind of psychological landscape to help us chart a path for our own lives. So for me, it's been just kind of getting closer and closer to characters, or at least that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you. There's another question about sort of thinking about the trauma that Jaryk goes through and hides. Was it difficult to find ways to show what he went through in developing his character?
In general, it was difficult for me to write Yaryk's character. So this is someone who has lived through incredible trauma, and to feel like I could be inside of his skin to write these sections was in general a difficult undertaking. The process that I used was to write character journals. So to try and write in the voice of Jaryk, to try and write in the voice of Lucy, asking them questions and just trying to see where they might go through a sort of free writing process. And that gave me a degree of confidence that I could start to write about someone who was very different from me, that I could find a way to identify with him. And that identification is really through specificity, finding what are the moments of his life that are just Jaryk, that are just him, you know. And with narrative that involves trauma, I think there's always a risk that that trauma can overdetermine the book, that it can start to overshadow everything else in the novel. And that was and there's also the risk that you can underdetermine, that you can ignore the trauma. And so for me, it was kind of the balancing act of trying to make sure that Jaryk felt like a real person in the here and now, but that we also had a respect for his difficult history.
Yeah. And I appreciate the way you're talking about that specificity, because I think that's what helped ground it, was these hyper-specific images that and moments that kind of added to that depiction. How did you land on the synagogue job for Jaryk when he was so adamant about being non-religious?
Well, I think I think I was really attracted to the rabbi character, is probably the honest answer to that. You know, I've had the privilege of getting to hang out with some pretty mystical rabbis, and I think the rabbi who appears in this book is probably some composition of all of the ones that I've met, in addition to the ones from Isaac Bashevis Singer. But the other thing that I think it does for the book is it allows Jaryk to have a confidant. And this is one of the challenges that I think writers face, where if you have a character who's reserved, who is not going to share their feelings, it's important to have moments where readers can get access to what they're feeling beyond the interiority. And so the rabbi, as someone who provides counsel, allows, I think, the reader to have another vantage point into who Jaryk is.
Yeah. Other curiosities or questions? So, short stories about to come out, many worlds there, complex novel. One more question, and then I'll come back to that, kind of thinking ahead. Did you find it difficult to go back and forth in time and to kind of move, and I'll kind of add to that, to move between those scenes and to figure out how to juxtapose them and when?
To some extent, but I will say I find it more difficult to write linearly. And I also have a monkey brain. So I'll be thinking about, if I'm doing the dishes, I'll be thinking about doing the dishes. And then the next moment I'll be thinking about something from my childhood. And the moment after that, I'll be thinking about the book that I want to get from the library. So that's my brain. I don't think it's that uncommon. And where as we're in our thoughts, we're constantly jumping back and forth in time. And this was, of course, something that folks like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce were really interested in exploring, which was an influence for me as I started writing my own books. That's something that I think is a big part of my literary style.
Yeah. So, and I wonder if in today's world, any of us have linear brains. As readers, as writers, we're so used to multitasking and thinking in all these different modalities and trying to do 5 things at once that I wonder if any of us have that. And then sort of storytelling brain. Another kind of process question for Margaret is, can you talk about the actual process of working with monkey brain? Do you use note cards, timelines? You mentioned using these kind of character journals. How do you pull all of this together?
How do you write a novel in 30 seconds or less?
Not a big question at all.
Yeah. So let me see how I can express this succinctly. So yes, I do a lot of character journaling to help me get close to characters. I have a set of questions that I ask characters that helps me kind of get off the ground and get closer to them. And then once I have a draft, I will go through and I will actually try and catalog all of my scenes. So I will take every scene as its own kind of element and try to understand what's happening in that scene. Is it working? Is it not working? But I think that maybe an even more succinct way of talking about this is how George Saunders talks about writing fiction, which is this sort of smell test, really, which is like as you're reading a line, like is that line exciting you, making you happier, or does it feel like it's dragging you down? And I think that process of kind of just like finding your own intuition line by line is just as worthy. And that's the process by which each of us develops our own aesthetic.
Well, and I'm still thinking about you saying your love for poetry, then short stories, then novels, and that language question I think is so rooted in the poetics of it too.
For sure. Yeah.
As we kind of conclude, I'm curious what's next. You've had 2 books out in just over 2 years. What are you working on? Who are you reading?
Sure. So I'm working on a new novel. It's a little too early for me to talk intelligently about it, but I am gearing up for the release of the story collection next month with various essays and other commitments that I have toward that. In terms of what I'm reading, I'm actually rereading Bernard Malamud. I am reading a literary journal called Conjunctions. I just finished Trust by Hernan Diaz. Lots of things. Lydia Yuknovich, her latest novel. So a bunch of things on my desk at the moment.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for your questions. Our next event is at the end of the month in person with Sylvia Begar and talking about Cassoulet Confessions and several more events in the series. So thank you, Jai. Thank you everyone for